All right. Happy Thursday. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. This is Simon Sadri. I am Technical Delivery Director at Argano. And today we're planning on presenting to you UDE, a Unified Development Environment. We're going to cover a few things around, as far as the agenda is concerned. We're going to cover a few things, and with me I have Caleb, our Senior Manager Delivery, that will be co-hosting this session with me and getting in. And also once we get to the bottom of the presentation and we open up for Q&A, we'll be able to answer any question that you might have. In terms of what we're going to be covering today, just to kind of give you a overview of what we're going to be covering today is we're going to go over the UDE architecture. We're going to see what components of that that we need to be considered and planned for deployment. We're going to talk about some key capabilities around the technical capabilities of UDE. We're also going to look at some comparison in terms of features and functions between a traditional CHE or cloud-hosted environment or Tier 1 versus now UDE and see some of those highlights. We're going to also look at some general recommendations and best practices when it comes to deployment and how to use scenarios, but also looking into some roadmaps, some future features and functions to be expected. And last but not least, we get into a QA session. All right, so let's take a look at UDE. So from a high-level perspective, what is UDE? So you can look at that as a stripped-down, simplified version of what we know of today as a Tier 2, typically a sandbox, which is Microsoft managed or Microsoft hosted, software as a service environment where Microsoft is managing the installation or the environment for us. So very similar to a Tier 2. We also will see in the UDE, we typically have a single application object server, or AOS. It's no longer a server. In the cloud, is actually running as a web service inside IaaS and manages versus various interactions with the user. And the AOS will be handling various processes, either real-time or interactive, as well as batch process loads. From perspective of application lifecycle management, engineering lifecycle management, the capabilities are the same here in the UDE. And you'll have a local Visual Studio integrated development environment, or IDE, that is connected to a environment that sits in the cloud. When it comes to UDE, from architecture perspective, we typically talk about two distinct tiers. There is a development tiers, where the code is developed and metadata is developed and managed, which is hosted locally on the developer's machine, where the Visual Studio IDE is running. And then we talk about an execution tier, which is essentially the cloud side of the story, where the AOS, Azure SQL Server, or Azure SQL, and the Dataverse is they're all hosted on the execution tier. So that's the kind of a distinct from architecture. We talk about development versus execution. In terms of other capabilities that UDE provides to us is any incremental X++, package updates or Microsoft updates. Those are done within the environments. We're going to talk about that, as I mentioned, the execution layer of it, or the tier of it, is all sitting in the cloud. Again, think about it as a stripped down version of a Tier 2 VM that is hosted by Microsoft. You have remote debugging capability directly from your Visual Studio IDE, and you also have capability to connect to various online environments of Dynamics 365. You can do remote X++ unit test execution that is directly done and executed from your local Visual Studio IDE on the developer's machine. And you still have that just-in-time type of capability to access a SQL Server also directly from your Visual Studio IDE. All right. So as far as UDE, so what kind of problems or boundaries or obstacles is UDE actually solving for us once we move away from the traditional CHE and onto the UDE deployment? So we know as a fact that when you, as a developer, you leverage various development platforms that are available to you, anything from X++ development to Dataverse to any kind of a .NET Power Platform. So each of these applications or technologies have their own development platform. So that barrier has been way too high in the traditional sense up to now. You basically, from a developing and testing and debugging that sort of extends across the X++ and Dataverse, were extremely challenging because of the fact that those development are separate development platforms. The other things that we see the UDE kind of solving and helping us around in terms of efficiency is setting up and configuring the traditional CHE or tier 1 environments was kind of complex because you had too many options as an individual engineer, and you would manage those on your own depending on and based on how you deploy and configure those VMs. You had X number of capabilities from LCS that you could configure that to your wants and to your needs, and that was complex. Like things around, like when you're deploying, there are different deployment topologies, like demo versus a dev test deployment. You could choose between a develop or a build and test machine. You had options to choose various VM sizes, default or customize VNet configurations, premium storage, manage disk settings, whether you go with standard LRS where you use HDD versus a premium SSD, all were handled through an LCS portal managed by the developer. So that complexity is basically been taken care of. Now, in terms of other things that we can consider has always been a little bit of a challenge between when you go through a development experience that has to do with Dynamics 365 finance and supply chain management versus the CE applications, because as we know, these applications have their own development platforms, and from a language or application programming language, they're also different. A good example is that obviously for finance and supply chain, we're using the application language and the background is X++. In C is not the case. It's JavaScript predominantly, but there's also C# and some aspects of web API. So those platforms are inherently different. And that's something that UDE tries to solve as well by moving that to a common platform. If you remember from a Dataverse, now it's called Dataverse, but what it was a common data services in the past, or CDS, which was Microsoft's attempts to create a kind of a common denominator between these two applications, so you could do integration development in a smarter way, and that kind of a mindset has kind of carried on all the way to UDE as well. So what are those benefits that we can kind of highlight now based on the conversation that we had around efficiency and we're going to talk about the total cost of ownership, that ultimately that's what boils down to. We can see that with the use of UDE, we can kind of do using those common tools that I mentioned is going to be more effective, faster innovation, because you're using a common technology. You can also see that the business outcomes will be a lot improved since you're using technologies that are common across platforms, and is easier overall development experience. You can easily manage workload and with the simplified types of administration experience, because again, the commonality of the underlying technology is being sort of merged. Overall development experience and productivity is increased because we know, as an example, a debugger runs a lot faster in UDE kind of compared to the traditional CHE. Environment setup is a lot faster too. A lot of things, especially around the Power Platform, now are automatically taken care of. Dataverse configurations is no longer down to the engineers to do that. It kind of comes with the with the package. Troubleshooting as another thing. Every time a developer needs to investigate an issue and debug and reverse engineer an issue, the first thing they ask for is, I need the latest, greatest database refresh. And obviously, moving from a cloud-based SQL or Azure SQL down to a tier 1, which is a SQL Server on-prem, there's a lot of steps involved. It's not just a backup and a restore. It's also transformation of a traditional back to a back file. So there's a lot of time that kind of spent just to convert and massage the data so that you could convert that from a tier 2 or higher down to a developer's tier 1. So efficiency is there as well. Then, of course, the security and compliance, because UDE is very, very much similar to a tier 2 sandbox, more simplified, of course, but it's all managed by Microsoft. So when it comes to security, periodic updates and maintenance, all as a part of that UDE SLA. So essentially that translates to a lower total cost of ownership. All right, moving on to some of the highlights that I mentioned, kind of a little bit more specific, a little bit more objectively mentioned here. So essentially, from a data refresh from the production, since the UDE is considered a tier 2, a lookalike, so the data can easily be retrieved once you connect your UDE to that particular online environment. So you don't really need to refresh your database all that often anymore, because your UDE can be connected to, literally with the right privilege and permissions, can be connected to any tier 2 or higher online environment. And then also, in addition to that, you could expedite the speed for downloading or exporting and importing and refreshing the database by basically skipping the transactional data, which is the bigger bulk part of any databases are the transactions. So you have that option now through a filter where you can exclude the transaction data if they're not needed. So that kind of cuts down the time, overall time, to a fraction of the time. Just-in-time access. We know in a tier 2 and higher right now, you can apply or request a temporary access to that tier 2 Azure SQL database. The same thing is available here now, which kind of ties to the data need for rapid database refreshes, kind of goes hand in hand. You could literally connect your UDE to any online environment and access the database if you need to. From a Dataverse perspective, it's all automatically set for you and configured. And, with the Dataverse, typically we talk about additional configuration and installation of like dual write, virtual entities, business events, and then in some cases also access to Copilot, some of the latest technologies, client plugins, or Synapse Link for analytics and such. All of that is automatically taken care of because it's a Microsoft managed environment. From a perspective of trace parser, it's the same tool set is available to you, but I can also mention that the addition to that is that since you connect directly to an online environment, like a tier 2 sandbox, you can actually capture a trace as you're navigating through your scenarios where the problem might lie. And you have that trace available in that environment. So when the developer connects to that online environment, they can retrieve that trace, recorded trace parser, ingest it into the trace parser app, and start analyzing the data. So you don't have to kind of having someone to record that for you and send it to you, or you log into that environment to download the trace file, then import it into your VM, local VM, all that kind of interactions are no longer necessary. And then CI/CD, again, that's also available for any type of continuous integration and development or deployment. And we have a couple of slides that kind of dives a little bit deeper into that as well. Next thing that I want to mention here, kind of putting some of those features and functions that are very critical across the two environments, the CHE or cloud hosted environment, or tier one developer boxes. There's so many names for that, versus a UDE, which is the kind of online environment of that. From an Azure subscription perspective, you're no longer applicable to a UDE. So that's sort of when we earlier talked about total cost of ownership. So that's one area to note. Security and compliance. Again, the UDE sits in the cloud and is managed by Microsoft. So that's kind of it speaks for itself. You no longer have to manually manage that as a customer or a developer. Azure quota management, it's no longer applicable because it's all managed by Microsoft. When it comes to environment setup time, efficiency, we typically in a CHE environment could take anything around 6 hours or sometimes more, depending on how many components you're going to turn on. Versus a UDE that we talked about hours, it's could be around 2 hours, but in most cases, what I've seen and documentations, it's around an hour. So it's a huge efficiency right there. When it comes to service updates, periodic quality updates, again, it's all Microsoft managed, so you don't need to, as a developer or a customer, to kind of keep track of those individually. When it comes to Microsoft Power Platform, and especially around the Dataverse integration, as I mentioned, the dual write, virtual entities and such, business events, is all fully integrated and configured for you. So you don't need to do the additional steps to take care of that, typically in a CHE environment that you have to do that manually and individually. Service and quality update rollbacks. In the case of a failure, essentially in a UDE environment, it behaves very much like a tier 2 sandbox, where a automatic rollback is supported. So if there is a failure with that particular update, it would behave just like it does today in a tier 2 and higher, which automatically rolls back. So you don't have that limitation that you have today when you have a typical local VM or tier 1 VM. Total cost of ownership, with all those things that I mentioned, obviously time is the essence. So everything's is faster in a UDE deployment. For those reasons, the total cost of ownership is lower as well, exponentially. When it comes to copying and production data, for any sort of reverse engineering or troubleshooting or debugging, is typically takes less than 4 hours versus a traditional CHE deployment that could take many hours or days to do that. Deploying changes and updates and customizations to an online environment, it should take only a few minutes in a UDE setting versus taking hours in a traditional CHE or tier 1 environment. When it comes to customer managed keys, that's not possible in a CHE tier 1 environment, but it's available now in UDE because it works and is managed very similar to a tier 2 or higher. So all those customer managed Azure Key Vaults can be available in a UDE situation. All right. Now, some of the other aspects of when it comes to factors comparison across the two deployment topologies, extending a Copilot capabilities for Dynamics 365, is not supported in the tier 1. There actually several of those services that are no longer available in CHE or a tier 1 environment. The other important one is like microservices or add-ins. Those are no longer available or supported in a tier 1 developer box, which was at some point, and then it was deprecated. And some of the examples for those microservices are inventory visibility, some of the popular ones, financial reporting, planning optimizations, export to Azure Data Lake, and the list goes on and on. So those are no limitations anymore once you move on to UDE. Bring your own device, BYOD. So obviously in the CHE, you were bound to use a VM that you deploy from your Azure tenant through LCS, and then you deploy that environment there. And with the UDE, you're not limited to that. You could still do that type of topology. You can still use a VM, but very much so you can bring your own device. You can bring your own laptop, or desktop, and you have that sort of a flexibilities there. When it comes to running X++, unit test in UDE is X++ unit testing is now available in Azure DevOps pipelines when you're using UDE, and can be automated along with the code deployments. So that's something that is now available and was never supported in a CHE deployment. With CD or continuous deployment, in addition to any sort of Dynamics 365 solutions or X++ solutions, you can also deploy Dataverse, such as dual write, virtual entities, and such that you have developed as custom solutions. And you can all together could be deployed as one solution to UDE. So you're not sort of limited anymore. When it comes to connecting multiple online versions or environments of Dynamics 365, multiple runtime versions, you can do that. You can connect to that to your local Visual Studio IDE. You can also debug your code at much faster pace. There are some protocols that have been enhanced in UDE that leads to faster code debugging process or experience. And then for the first time, you can actually debug back jobs directly in a UDE setting, which was never available in a CHE. Moving on to the next slide. I mentioned topology and capacity in the past. Those are important to kind of mention here. There are some best practices or requirements in terms of storage. For every UDE environment, you need at least 2 GB of storage. When it comes to capacity, especially around the Dataverse, whether it's the database itself or the Dataverse related files, there are some capacity requirements that should be mentioned. The database should be 10 gigs. And then for every user license, you add another 250 megabyte. As far as the Dataverse files, 20 gigs plus 2 gigabyte additional storage per user license. And that could be served for various additional attachments, physical files, and things of that nature. When it comes to topology from the VM perspective, you basically in a CHE setting, we typically recommended a E8 V5, which consisted of 8 virtual CPUs and 64 gigs of RAM. That seemed to be the best configuration for cost versus performance ratio. That seemed to be the kind of a sweet spot there. But with the UDE, those requirements drop quite a bit. So you need probably around 4 CPUs, virtual CPUs, and only 16 gigs of RAM to get started. Obviously, it behaves much faster on a solid state drive, like premium type. But the kind of sweet spot from a perspective of VM size seems to D4S, which is a lot cheaper than the E8 series, seems to be performing fine. And then the other 2 topologies that mentioned here is Windows 365, option 1 and 2. The option 1 is the minimum for CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM. And then more of a premium side is that where you double up the number of virtual CPUs and double up the number of RAM. That seems to be a good configuration. And with that, I think that was my last slide. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Caleb to give you some additional information, especially around the installation. It's not going to be a whole lot of step-by-step type. It's more high level, just give you some of the gotchas to kind of know what that entails. Also, from a perspective of writing, deploying, and debugging code, what are some of the things that we need to take into account with respect to the unified development and experience, some capacity, some sample capacity information, some roadmap. And then I added a couple of FAQs, sort of the common questions that we get, like in terms of, can you share your single UDE with other developers as an example, or can a single developer workstation be used for across multiple UDEs? What are the answers? And so we get to that right before we open up for the final Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to Caleb. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. So again, as he said, my name is Caleb Blanchard. I'm a senior manager delivery here at Argonaut. So I'm going to continue here, and we'll get into a demo in just a couple minutes here. But the terms of setting up the development tools on a local PC, first, you're going to make sure that you have a system admin role in the UDE, and there's really two places basically that you're going to need that, and that's both in F&O itself, but also just like you would today, but also on the actual UDE CRM environment or the Dataverse environment. You're going to need an admin role there as well, because that's going to be required to do things like deploying your code and just really connecting to it from Visual Studio in general is going to require that. So both places it's going to be needed. For Visual Studio 2022 itself, there's been kind of long-standing guidelines, I guess, as to what needs to be installed for that. But basically, it's like you need the .NET development feature, and then there's a couple of other individual components that need to be installed as well to support it. But then also the new piece here is installing the Power Platform Visual Studio extension for Visual Studio 2022. The other thing is the cross-reference database that's used by whenever you right-click on a piece of code and go to find references. That uses a cross-reference database. That database does run locally, or will need to run locally, and it can be run either on just local DB, or I typically prefer to just install SQL Server Developer Edition on my local machine there, just because it just gives a little bit more flexibility with things. But you can just use a local DB. I will say that I believe there's like a 10 gig limit or something on local DB, if I remember correctly, and the XREF database does get close to that limit. And so if there's a lot of maybe ISV models or just a lot of custom code, it's possible that the cross-reference database could get pushed over that 10 gig limit, where you might actually need something like SQL Server Developer Edition. On the right-hand side there, just the download in the auto setup client tools. Basically, we'll show some of this in the demo here. So I won't necessarily go over all of those here, just because that's going to be in the demo. We'll show some of that. Next slide, just writing and developing code, deploying and developing code. It's really not a whole lot different than what happens today in the cloud-hosted environments. You're creating a model. If this is the first time you're making mods for a particular project or what have you, creating a project, adding your objects into that project and building the project, right? All of that happens locally on the local machine. The compile happens on the local, all that happens locally. But then when your code is compiled, you're going to go ahead and deploy that code. And this is where then things shift. So it's going to, package up that code and then send a message to the Power Platform admin center to deploy the code to the environment. And so that will happen in the cloud. When a database sync is kicked off, that'll happen in the online environment as well. And then any unit testing, of course, is going to run against the actual environment itself in the cloud. And then to debug X++ code, again, we'll show this a little bit in the demo. Basically, you're just like today, you're going to select which models you want to be able to debug. And that's purely from a performance perspective of not having to load absolutely everything every time you want to debug. And so you'll select which models. Again, that's something that's done today in cloud-hosted environments. Set your breakpoints and everything. It's just the only difference really with debugging for the most part is where you kick off the debug session from. And we'll show that in the demo. So to create, update, deploy, delete, and debug, all that, we are creating a project from with the project templates, just like today, developing code. So this is in relation specifically to Dataverse, right? So if you're writing code against the Dataverse itself. So I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, but this is kind of describes what those steps would be if you're working against the Dataverse side of the UDE. And then so there's kind of a different thoughts on how one could actually go about developing against the UDE. The first and foremost one there is the local machine, just using your local laptop, desktop, whatever it is, right in front of you, and having Visual Studio installed directly there and connecting directly from that machine. There's also the ability to use something like having a VM that's in the cloud. It doesn't need to be quite as beefy of a VM like the cloud-hosted environments are today. It could just be something that's got 4 cores and 16 gigs of RAM. And so that could be something that's running under an Azure subscription, or you could use something. I've used a Windows 365 VM as well and had good results for that. And so we've gone over the fact that you can connect the local Visual Studio to multiple different repositories and different UDEs, and you can switch between them. But there could be an advantage to having just maybe one VM out in the cloud per project. That's more along the lines of maybe from a partner perspective, where we are working on multiple different projects at a time. But those are some of the options in terms of where does the development actually happen. This slide is a little hard to read at this point. It's kind of small text, but basically this is just giving an example of what maybe the capacity looks like. So the capacity, so in the UDE model, you are charged, or the cost of running the UDE comes out of the capacity that you have, you're based on the licensing that you have purchased. So, and that's what's kind of showing up here on the right hand side, is based on all the different license types. It's showing all the different license types that this customer has, and how many gigabytes of capacity basically they're given. And so, for example, if you've purchased licensing and that licensing gives you, I'm just using fake numbers here, 100 gigabytes of capacity for F&O, and let's say, and Dataverse, whatever, and a particular, let's say your current production database is 10 gigs. Basically, that would allow you to run 10 environments total, including production, but basically 10 environments under this Power Platform model, just for the cost of your licensing. So there's no extra cost that like you'd be paying today for cloud-hosted environments. So your Azure subscription, there'd be no extra cost. Where the extra cost would come in is when you go over that capacity limit, then you're going to be paying per gigabyte. But that's an example of that right there. This slide just shows some of the links to some various resources that can be helpful in terms of the unified developer experience, the unified admin experience. So those links can be helpful to read up a little bit more on that. So here's a roadmap. This slide's slightly old. This was pulled from Microsoft, so it's a little bit old at this point, but I don't think the timeline has changed too much since this was released. But basically, back in June, the unified developer experience was GA'd. And what we're looking forward to next is in October having the full actual unified admin experience, G8 as well. And then, as far as we know as of right now, LCS is scheduled basically to be deprecated at the end of 2025. So at that point, things would be switched over. And you can see there's different milestones here where in November, routing new customers would go to the Power Platform admin instead of LCS. And then starting to migrate in April of 2025, starting to migrate existing customers from LCS to Power Platform Admin Center. So that's the roadmap from Microsoft. Sorry, we're getting Q&As that says the screen is not showing. If I'm just clicking through the slides. I don't know if our moderators are still on, if they know what's going on, but I've got two questions in here saying the slides are not showing.
Should be a slight delay, about 5 seconds, I've heard. So I don't know if that's passed or not.
Are they not showing at all? I guess I
can see it on my end. Yeah, I can see it fine on my end. It looks like somebody said they needed to refresh their screen, so maybe that's what it needs to be done.
Yeah, someone had to refresh. So yeah, if you're having an issue, try rejoining the meeting and seeing if that shows up then.
Yeah.
All right, sorry, we'll keep going here. So we're going to go into a slide here with some upcoming features for the roadmap. This is post GA. So support for sovereign clouds. If you're in that scenario, that's coming. Being able to do a point-in-time restore to the environment, and potentially from a point-in-time restore within the environment, or from, for example, from production as well, to be able to recover a deleted environment, ability to select and copy options from, so this is transactionless copy from UI via UI. So they're working on the ability to basically copy data, for example, from production, but remove the transactions, which would of course shrink your database size down probably significantly, therefore saving you capacity. So that's something that's coming. Microsoft Managed Updates. So today, Microsoft is currently automatically installing the proactive quality updates in these environments, but what's coming would be the ability for them to also push full service updates when necessary to these environments. SQL just-in-time custom read and writer roles. Right now there's just a strict reader and a strict writer access, but there's going to be some more customization to that coming. They're looking to try to reduce the size of that cross-reference database for the reasons I mentioned, so that they can still utilize local DB for that. And then Visual Studio add-ins. So basically for add-ins that need to be able to access the database directly, we're going to address using SQL just-in-time credentials. So, and then we're going to jump into the demo.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's go ahead and do a quick demo here on some of the features and functionality of the UDE. As you can see here, I've got Visual Studio up. I'm actually running this all in a Windows 365 VM. I'm running it with a 8-core VM with All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's go ahead and do a quick demo here on some of the features and functionality of the UDE. As you can see here, I've got Visual Studio up. I'm actually running this all in a Windows 365 VM. I'm running it with a 8-core VM with 32 gigs of RAM, but as you saw in the other slides, you can run this on a 4-core 16 gigs of RAM, and I've done that, and I've seemed to got pretty good results there as well. Didn't really see much of a slowdown anywhere, but that's what I'm running on at the moment. So I've got Visual Studio 2022 open here, And for the purposes of this demo, we're actually going to utilize the AOT browser project, just because it's open source. We at Argonaut, originally Arbella did write this, and so we'll just use this for our demo today in terms of making some small changes and showing what that looks like for the UDE. So to start off with, when you first are getting started, you're going to need to go to the extensions, and I've already got it installed here, but you would need to install the Power Platform tools for Visual Studio 2022. Because everything for UDE is now basically in the Power Platform Admin Center, the Power Platform tools is actually what does a lot of the connection work between Visual Studio and the UDE. So the first thing you do is go ahead and download this Power Platform tools for Visual Studio 2022. That would require restarting Visual Studio and everything. But once you do, in the Tools menu, you now have a few new options here. One of which, the first one would be the Connect to Dataverse. And that would be our first step here. So I'm going to go ahead and click this. Now, I've connected to a UDE before, and so it's going to ask me if I want to just go ahead and reconnect to the UDE that I've already connected to in the past. But I'm going to go ahead and say no on this, just so I can show you what the normal connection form looks like. This is what the connection form looks like the first time you log in. There's the on-premises option, but also the Office 365. That's what we're going to want to use. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to uncheck the sign in as current user because I want to use this specific user that's down here. I'm also going to turn off the display list of available organizations. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that URL in here. So basically what it is it's the name of the we'll say quote unquote CRM instance that we're talking to. You'll notice here in the example it does have CRM here, so this is not the FNO URL. This is going to be the Dataverse URL essentially. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and it's going to start to connect here. All right, once it gets connected, it's going to ask you to select a solution. Microsoft's recommendation here is to just select the default here and then click Done. So we are now connected to Power Platform. If this was the first time I was connecting, it would actually have a pop-up here, and it would ask me if I want to download the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation assets. And of course, I would hit yes on that, and it would go ahead and kick off the download, and the progress of that would be shown in the output. And we'll show you what it actually downloads here in a minute. First, let's go ahead and open up the options for the Power Platform tools. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Tools, go to Options, and then I'm going to scroll down here to the Power Platform Tools section and look at what the options are here. These are not the defaults. These are things that I have set up myself. I'm not going to go through all these. I'll just hit a few highlights. Basically, some of these are about logging, and in my opinion, most of the time, the more logging, the better, so I can see what's going on. So we've got display detailed log data. We've got captured detailed Dataverse communications logs. This skip discovery when connecting to Dataverse. This is why it asked me for a URL at the beginning. If I had this turned off, then it would actually give me a list of environments that I could connect to. But I just prefer actually to just go ahead and put in the URL myself, so I have that checked. This download logs for operations if using unified environments. So I have this set up so that it will automatically download the logs for me when I'm doing a deploy or a synchronize of the database, so that if there's an issue, I can go right to the logs on my local machine and not have to go out to Power Platform to get those logs. I've also unchecked the auto setup for D365. I just kind of prefer to do things manually myself, but you can go ahead and check this, and it'll do things like automatically again, setting up D365 in terms of like setting up the XREF database and that type of thing. But I prefer to kind of do that myself, and I'll show you that in a little bit here as well. And then this other one is kind of a performance thing. Do not, especially if you're only going to be doing development with the for the unified environment for like D365 F&O. It's basically do not display the Power Platform Explorer on connecting to Dataverse. Actually, I'm going to check that because when you connect, it will pop that up, and it just takes a while to load. So I'm going to go ahead and check that now, and so that it doesn't do that the next time. So I'm going to click OK. So now let's go ahead and take a look at what is actually downloaded when you first connect to the environment that first time. So the download by default goes out to the local app data folder into a folder called Microsoft and then Dynamics. And I've got a couple of versions here that it's downloaded, but basically it's going to create a folder in there with the version number that your environment is currently on. So my environment is currently on this 92 version. So I'll open this up and we'll see what it downloaded. So what it downloaded is the trace parser installer. It downloaded a copy of the Dynamics F&O extension for Visual Studio. It downloaded a SQL BAK file that contains the standard XREF database. And then it also technically downloaded a package's local directory zip file, but when it downloads it, it automatically zips it or unzips it here and then gets rid of the zip file to kind of save some space here. But this is the package's local directory, just like you would see it on your cloud-hosted environments. And that's needed so that when you're compiling your code and it can reference the standard D365 code and all that would show up in your application explorer. So that's what gets downloaded. So once that's downloaded, especially if I don't have that auto checkbox turned on, I'm going to need to go ahead and install the Visual Studio extension for D365. Since I already have that installed, I don't have to do that now. But you would need to install that. And then once you have installed that, you would then have your Dynamics 365 menu here. Now, by default, it shows up here in the extensions menu, but I've unchecked it here so that it pulls it out of that and puts it in its own menu. So I've got my D365 menu, and it looks very similar to what you might be used to in the cloud-hosted environments. But we've got a few new options. Under Deploy here, there's a couple new options for deploy models to online environment and delete models from online environment, and those do exactly what you would think they would do. If I were to select deploy models, this is just going to show a list of all of the models that my metadata is currently pointing at, and I can choose which of these to deploy to the environment, and if I want it to do a database sync after it does the deploy. So I can select as many or as little packages here as I want. So I could check the AOT browser, and I want to go ahead and sync the database with this afterwards, and then I would hit deploy, and then it would show the progress of that in the output window. If for some reason you need to delete a model from an environment, you can do that as well. It's only going to let you delete custom models, and so that's why this one is the only one that's there is the AOT browser. So it's not going to let you delete standard Microsoft models, but if you needed to go ahead and delete a model for any reason, that's how you would do that. Another new option that's in the menu is this configure metadata section. And this is where you basically tell Visual Studio where your metadata is, for example, like your custom models and whatnot. So what you would do is you could have multiple configurations here if you were connecting to multiple different environments, or in the case of a Microsoft partner, you might potentially connect to multiple different clients, customers, so you might have different code bases and that sort of thing. I've just got the one here for right now, and I've just called it AOT browser. The name doesn't really matter. It just it's whatever you want to name it so that you know what it means. I typically put the environment name that I'm connecting to here in the description. That's not a requirement or anything like that. That's just what I like to do. And then for the cross-reference database, I'm pointing at just the local database, and then it says, well, what's the name of the database? And then here, this is the kind of the most important parts down here is this folder with your own custom metadata. So this I've got pointing at my repo for the AOT browser, and I've got it pointed at the metadata folder within my repo. And so that's where I want it to. That's how I tell it where's all the custom code for this, and that can include just like in the cloud-hosted environments, that can include models where you have the source code. It could also include the binary code for certain ISVs and that sort of thing, but that would all only be the custom metadata. We don't have to have a single folder with the custom metadata and the Microsoft metadata for this reason next, and that is the folders for reference metadata. So this is where I tell it, hey, where's my packages local directory that contains all of my Microsoft code? And so I've got it pointing there. And then the only other thing basically is this checkbox here for current. Now, again, I don't have any other extra configurations here, but if I did, the rest of them would be unchecked. And so this is how you tell Visual Studio which one you want to be using right at this moment. And so I would check the box here, hit save, and then that would tell Visual Studio that that's the metadata that I want to be looking at now. Moving on in the Dynamics 365 menu, we've also got the launch debugger. So no longer will you be going to debug and attaching to a process or reattaching to a process or anything like that. The way that you would attach to the UDE is to come in here and actually launch the debugger. We may be able to do an example of that here in a little bit, but what I've seen in my testing is that it's actually it attaches quicker than the cloud-hosted environments do, and so I was pleasantly surprised by that. Being able to get up and running with debugging is actually quicker here with the UDEs, so that's very nice. Within the Build Models menu, I want to show this as well. We do have a couple of newer options, one of which is deployed to connected online environment. That's basically the main one. So basically, it's after I build this code, I want you to go ahead and deploy the code that I've just checked off here and built to the online environment. And then also the synchronized database option, which has always been there. Of course, synchronizing the data will now be kicked off on the UDE and not like a local thing. And so, of course, what would happen is it would build this AOT browser. It would then, if I have this checked, it will deploy the code to the online environment. And then if I have this checked, it will then synchronize the database. So let's now take a look at the project that I've got open here. This is the AOT browser, as I mentioned. If I right-click on here and I go to my properties, I have a new option in here as well, and that's deploy changes to online environment, and I've got this set to true. I think for the most part, you're going to want to have this turned on. This is basically going to be the fastest way to get your code deployed when you're actively developing. So I've got this set to true here. If you don't set this to true when you build here, nothing will get deployed to the environment. So you would open it up and you wouldn't see any of your changes. So you would have to deploy it one of the ways I've already shown here. So I would recommend having that turned on, I think, most of the time. The other options you might see as you right click in here is you could actually deploy from here as well. So there's many different places that you can deploy the code from. And then, of course, like it's always been, there's the synchronize AOT, or the synchronize with the database here as well. So that can be done there also. So let's just go through just a quick little demo. This is obviously going to be very simple, very simplistic, but I want to show you what this might look like. So I'm just going to open up my main AOT browser form here. And I'm just going to do a very simple change. This is not something you would typically do, but I'm going to change the caption here from a label like it should be to just like some hard-coded text, but just to show the difference here. So basically, I'm just changing the caption so that it says AOT browser new instead. And so I'm going to go ahead and save that change, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to build. And this is going to do an incremental build, and it's going to do then an incremental deploy to the environment. And so you'll see down here in the option on the output, it's currently running through the build. The build completes pretty quickly. Now, again, I only made a small change here. And like I said, it's also just doing a incremental build. So now it's actually completed the build, and now it's actually moving into the deploy stage. And so this is, you see the output change now to FinOps Cloud Runtime, and this is just showing you the output of what it's doing out in the cloud. So it's now finishing, and actually I'll show this before I go to the browser. Down here it talks about the logs, and so this is where those checkboxes I mentioned earlier come in on the Power Platform tools about downloading the logs. So this first one says that you can download the logs from this URL, and so you could click that and you could get the logs, but since I have that checkbox turned on, the logs were already downloaded to this particular folder or zip file here, so I can basically just copy that, highlight that, copy that, throw that in my browser or my file window here, and then I can see the logs. In this case, it all compiled, or it all built successfully, so I don't really need to look at this, but if I had an error, there'd be an error file in here that I could take a look at and see what happened. You don't typically see errors when deploying, but where you might see them is on like a database sync or something like that. So my changes have been deployed. So let me switch over here. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. This is going to take me directly to the AOT browser, and we should see the new caption here. All right, and you see here we've got that new caption here with the new tacked on the end, and this is running again in the UDE up in the cloud. So that's what it looks like from a Visual Studio perspective, and what a developer's life might look like developing for UDE. Let's take a look at the Power Platform quickly. This is kind of more, an admin thing and not necessarily developer, but we'll take a quick look at it here. So first of all, let's go to the environment page. So once the environment's been deployed and has finance and operations installed in it, you'll have two different environment URLs here. This is the CRM URL, and then this is the operations URL. So clicking this one would just take me to the F&O UI. This one will take me to this next page over here. And what this shows is all of the published apps for this particular environment. But the one we want to look at here is the Finance and Operations Package Manager. And so I've already got that open over here. The first screen you see is the modules, and this is just going to be a list of all the custom modules that are currently installed on this particular environment, and it kind of tells you the last time that they were modified. So you see there just about a few minutes ago. And then the other main piece here is this operations history. So this is where we've got the where those logs are. Basically, if I had clicked that link, it would take me essentially to these logs here. So if I click on this deploy, here's my operations logs. I've got a zip file. I'm going to download that, but again, it already downloaded because of that checkbox that I had turned on. You'll see different things in here, like, for example, this proactive quality updates. So proactive quality updates are installed automatically by Microsoft. You can see that that's kicked off there by the Microsoft Lifecycle Orchestration Engine, but then you can see everything else, who kicked it off, and you can view that there, and again, view any logs that there may be. But this is, again, where you can see the operation history as to kind of what's taken place in this environment. To update the environment, so I mentioned that the proactive quality updates are installed automatically by Microsoft, but you can also go ahead under Resources and the Dynamics 365 apps, and you would scroll down to the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations Provisioning app. And you would normally come to the details. Now, mine says right now that the installation failed. I had a bit of an issue the other day with something. I lost my user license, essentially, and so I couldn't do the installation. But basically, what you would normally come up with is this other window here, which allows you to set the version that you would like to have installed. So, for example, I could go ahead and update to this preview version of 10.041. I just hit agree and then hit install, and then it would just take me back to the next page with a little yellow bar that states that the install was kicked off at such and such a time, and then you just kind of wait for that to complete, and so that's how you would install like a version update to the next version as well. So that's pretty much what we've got for the demo for you today. Hopefully that was informative and gave you kind of a look into the UDEs. And so I want to thank you for viewing this demo, and I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Caleb. That was perfect timing. I think we have about a minute remaining. Let me just double check. Checking to see if there are any questions. But one of the things that I would say frequently asked question is in terms of various deployments, is that can multiple developers share a single UDE? That's one typical question. And the answer to that is yes and no. So we're going to kind of talk about a little what that means. One of the topologies of UDE was instead of bring your own device, you could actually deploy that into a VM. So from that perspective, if that UDE resides inside a VM, then it could potentially be shared with multiple developers. However, there are, because of the multiple kind of a developers coding, the debugging, testing simultaneously, it's going to be an issue. So the answer is yes, as long as there are no simultaneous testing or debugging is going on. The other situation is that if you're dealing with hot fixes, if those hot fixes have an occasional nature, so they don't happen that very often, that is doable as well. The next thing is that if the developers are working on independent modules, or modules that are completely separate, there is no codes being shared across, that also doable in a multiple developer situation. The other typical question is that can a single developer workstation be used for multiple UDEs? So you essentially have one developer box or local machine, and you install multiple instances of UDE. The answer is yes, you could, technically you could do that, and the workstation can be used to connect to multiple UDEs, right? So you kind of have a configuration which you then need to change on the fly. It might be a little bit of a logistic issues, like which one are you connected to when you're debugging or what have you. So you gotta have to pay attention to which configuration your Visual Studio ID is grabbing a hold of at that point, so you kind of connect to the appropriate environment online. Yeah, with that, I'm going to conclude this. If you have any questions or any comments, you can reach us separately. Thanks for your attention. I wish you guys a great rest of your day and have a great weekend as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.